Hello members, it is a pleasure to have you here today on this special members only live stream broadcast, and today we're going to be talking about something that I actually really like to talk about and like to consume. It's Civil War food. Now, it's important to remember that those who fought in the Civil War had a very monotonous affair, and the things I'm going to show you today, you have to keep that in mind. Remember that this is what they're going to be having on campaign, on the march, day after day after day. So while it may seem like fun and tasty, it is the first 6 or 7 times you have it, but after that, it does tend to get monotonous. Now, when the Civil War started, of course, the Army had a standard ration, and that ration included in garrison baked bread, fresh vegetables, lots of meat, and things like that. And at the beginning of the war, the Confederate Army adopted the exact same ration requirements as the Union Army. However, the realities of war soon kicked in, and the concern became getting not only enough food to the soldiers, but enough preserved food. And remember, this is in the days when canning is still very much in its infancy. They could can things, but not in the quantities necessary to feed entire armies with canned food. And so many of the rations that both sides issued for armies on the march depended greatly upon how long they could last, how long they could be preserved. So most of the things we're going to talk about today are that campaign fare that they're having to ship in barrels and in boxes and things like that. Now, what that means is there's no more fresh baked bread, because fresh baked bread goes moldy after, a few days. You're not going to have any fresh vegetables as part of the Army ration. It's simply going to be too hard to keep those fresh. Perhaps you may get some bags of beans and things like that, but even that tends to be subject to spoilage. So what they're really looking for is very, very reliable, very, very hearty foods. So when it comes to meat, there are basically pork and beef, and both of those are going to be very, very heavily salted. I have some salt pork here, which was probably the most common, north and south, and it's just, it's pig meat. That's what pork is. It's pork bellies, pork sides, and it is literally packed and covered up in salt and salt and salt. The salt helps preserve it. Otherwise it's raw meat, it comes out, it's packed in salt, and it ships in barrels. And usually what they do is when it's time to issue rations, they'll have the group of men come by in lines and they'll issue these things out. So they're gonna get a certain portion of salt pork, which again is just salted meat. And depending upon north or south, sometimes it's going to vary. The north is going to get, let's see, a lot of these. And y'all are familiar with this, I'm sure by now, hardtack, right? It's flour and water and just a pinch of salt that's baked to be very hard, and it's baked very slowly, right? It's hardtack. The reason this works and it's not fresh bread is because in the baking process, all the moisture is basically heated out. There's no moisture left in this. So it really is just a hard cake of baked flour. And just for the record, do you know what else they used flour and water for back in those days? For paste to put up wallpaper. Not terribly delectable, but it's something that lasts a long time. They would box up crates and crates and wagons fulls of this. This is very much a standard Union Army fare. Sometimes they might issue loose rations. For example, the Union Army often got flour just in a sack, in a tote per man. The Confederacy usually got cornmeal. Corn is a much more widespread crop in the South. It's easier to process and to develop that way. Now, there's also something that was very common north and south at the beginning of the war, became more common in the north, and in the south it almost became a luxury amongst the Army. And of course I'm talking about coffee beans. You read some of the accounts from the Union Army, and the soldiers talk about how they lived on this stuff. They would have it for breakfast, lunch, dinner. If they were going to stop on the roadside at a march for a rest of even 10 or 15 minutes, they would try to get a fire going as fast as they can and boil up some coffee. Now, the South, again, did not have that much access to coffee. They had to either trade with the Union. Capturing Union guys was a very popular thing because they could get their rations. And they also found some substitutes. They would use chicory nuts or acorns or something like that, just anything to get that flavored hot water that has become and was at that time such an important part of American culinary fare. Now, the soldier's going to carry the things he needs to cook with and his food in this. This is called a haversack. This is a Union haversack. It's been treated on the outside to mostly keep out rain and moisture and things like that, but that's not always foolproof. And so this is the kitchen of the Civil War soldier. Not only is there food going to go in here, but the things they need to prepare and to consume the food are going to go in here. And a group of men would come together in both armies called a mess. And this mess would be anywhere from 4 to 8 men. It was not an official tactical unit by any stretch. It was very much an informal social organization, but these messes became very, very close-knit, and they would, at the end of the march, come together. They would, some men would gather firewood for the fire, some would go get water, some would begin drawing the rations and preparing those. So it was very much sort of the household unit of the Civil War soldier, and he would be very close to the men in his mess, and they would take turns carrying the heavy items that they're going to have. Every man is going to have a canteen, and the canteen is how they're going to carry their water, how they're going to get their water back to camp. And it's important to remember, as I've said, that these rations are going to be issued on an individual man-per-man basis, but when they come together in the mess, usually the ones who were the best cooks, given the supplies that they had to cook with, were the ones who were going to be assigned to actually prepare the food, while other folks were getting firewood or getting water, perhaps even standing guard duty if they had to. But this canteen is one of the most important parts of any soldier's kit, north or south, because water is incredibly important to have on the march and incredibly important to have in preparing food. Every soldier is going to somehow end up with a fork and a spoon, right? These are the basic things, but these are not just your eating utensils. This is what you prepare the food with. This is what you're going to use to eat your food, to prepare the food, to flip that hardtack and salt pork over in the pan. Everyone's going to have some kind of pocket knife to cut that salt pork apart, or just for usual standard camp chores. Amongst the mess, they might have a couple of these little pans to prepare mixes in and get other dry rations about. Someone's probably going to have a frying pan. Most of the men are going to have a boiler, and I'll show you one of those in a second, something to actually boil water and prepare coffee in. It could also be used to boil small portions of meat. And of course, everyone's going to have a cup to drink their coffee from. And sometimes a lot of these items are going to be things that you cook with too. If you don't have a frying pan, very often they're going to use a half of a canteen or a plate, and that plate is going to become your frying pan, which is why this is also an incredibly important and often overlooked part of the Civil War's soldiers' kitchen equipment. Just a piece of cloth, but when you're around a fire, you're going to have to get hot things, you're going to have to wipe stuff off, and it's very important for preparing that coffee, and we'll get to that too in a second. So with this fairly basic equipment and this monotony of rations that are available, you may be surprised to know that the Civil War soldiers found a lot of different ways to prepare this food. Of course, it's a finite amount of ways, but they were always trying to look for variety. And before we get into some of the actual recipes from the Civil War, I have to, point out too that it's not all hardtack and cornmeal and salt pork. The soldiers did sometimes have access to other foods, especially if they're on the march. If they're on the march and they're in enemy territory and they come upon a farm and they capture some of the food in the barn, they may have access to some fresh vegetables, to some fresh pig and cow, depending upon how liberating they want to get with the farmland that they come across. Sometimes in the north even there were settlers that could travel around and would have delicacies. You could get canned evaporated milk, you could get canned peaches, tobacco was very popular if they could get it. So it's not just these items, but these items that we're going to be talking about today really form the basic subsistence groups of the Civil War soldier. So let's go take a look at some of those recipes. So we're going to go ahead and get our coffee going first. I've pointed out I mentioned the boiler. This is a boiler. It's basically just a cup like I had before with a lid and a handle put on it. And you fill it up with water, get the water sort of hot. And we're going to take some beans, just a few coffee beans. We're going to put them inside our handy dandy towel. And we're going to use an even handier bayonet. You're going to see this bayonet quite a bit, by the way, folks. You take your bayonet and you can just crush those beans up, right? Crush them up. This is not a complicated process. I'm going to open that up. We're going to just put those ground up coffee beans in the coffee there. and let that boil up. So that can be prepared, that can be getting ready while we do the rest of it. So now we've got some salt pork. We're just gonna, I mean, this is the first basis for most prep for Civil War meals. You get some salt pork, you put it in that community shared frying pan, and you just put that over the fire and get it to going. Soldiers very often complained about the pork and the beef that was salted. You read accounts, they called it salt horse, because you know it is salted and it's in those barrels, but conditions are not perfect and those barrels may not be perfectly sealed. So when these soldiers open up a bad barrel of salt pork or salt beef, that may have gone kind of bad and they can't just throw it away. So you get issued the nearly rancid salt pork or salt beef. If that happens too often, you get a lot of complaints from the soldiers, and the armies tried not to do that if they could help it, but sometimes, you know, they get what they get or they don't eat at all. And so salt pork is kind of like low quality bacon, really, with a lot of salt in it. So sometimes they would try to soak it maybe overnight in water to draw as much of the salt out as possible. But oftentimes they would just take it out of their haversack, cut it into pieces and put it in the frying pan to fry it up. One of the things that this does, it gives you a very flavorful type of meat, but it also, especially the pork, puts off a lot of grease. And that grease is going to become a main component in most of the other recipes that we have. So we've fried up some salt pork and we've got a little bit of grease in the pan, so we're going to create something the Union soldiers made called skilly-gally. And again, incredibly basic, but you get some good grease in the bottom of the pan from your salt pork. And if you've been wise, you've soaked some hardtack in water for however long it takes to get the hardtack kind of soft. Sometimes it's overnight, sometimes maybe done in 15 or 20 minutes. So you just take that soaked through hardtack, you just put that in the frying pan with the grease, and then you set it to frying. And then when that one side gets done, you flip it over and you can just put a piece of salt pork on top of that and you've got skilly-gally. So, you know, the presentation may be somewhat lacking, but there's a lot of salt to this, but it's going to be very flavorful, if somewhat monotonous, and they're going to find different ways to make things along, but there's you some classic skilly-gally. It certainly does taste better than just plain old hardtack. There's a good bit of salt in there, but it's not bad. Again, after the first six or seven times, it's really tasty. So there are a few accounts of people being really creative. So, you know, what do they have for dessert? Well, not anything usually, but there's one account of a fellow coming upon an orchard and picked some apples and sliced the apples up and sort of put them in a little bit of sugar water and sort of soaked them to get them soft overnight. And then he would take, the next day, he took some flour and mixed it up into a paste and tried to put the apples inside of it and used just the same equipment, no oven of course, but a frying pan and things to try to make a camp apple pie. And the account doesn't really say much about it. He just says, you know, it was food, we ate it. Basically, he said it was edible. He didn't say if it was any good or if it was even close to apple pie, but just gives you an idea of the creativity that these soldiers would have with trying to do anything that they could with their meals. So next, what we're going to do is a Confederate dish that was very common called Kush. And what we've got here, we've fried some more salt pork, and we've got some delicious salt pork grease in the bottom of the pan here. So we're going to add a little bit of cornmeal to this. Again, there's no specific instructions. And we're just going to take that and kind of mix it up, see what kind of mess we can create with the grease and the cornmeal to kind of just get the cornmeal flavored. You can see it kind of ends up, it looks incredibly deceptively like brown sugar, but it ain't. I can tell you that. So we've got some grease and cornmeal there mixed up. And now what we want to do is add just a little bit of water along, kind of mix it up and get something more doughy. I'm not as old in hand as some of these people would have been mixing this up. But you see, we're getting there. We're getting more to almost a sort of a cornbread texture for the not the mix, but that. So now what we're going to do, we're going to put our frying pan back on the fire, and we're going to take some of this and put just a touch more water in there, just a touch. Yeah, there we go. That's a little better. And yeah, I think too, a lot of the creativity comes from wanting to eat something different. A lot of the creativity comes from just wanting something to do in the monotony of camp too, right? They're bored. You know, they're not fighting all the time. They've been marching all day and they just want to do something. So close to Johnny cakes or hoe cakes or travel cakes or something like that. That's really what this is, with just a little bit of flavoring added in from the grease from the salt pork. The soldiers are always writing about how hungry they are and how they're not getting good food. And you see surgeons' reports of how the men are not being properly fed. It's not that the armies, especially the Confederate Army, wasn't aware of the problem. Just from a supply standpoint, there's not much they can do for it. But this is a grotesque, but I think very telling descriptor of the different kind of rations they would have in each army and how well fed they are. I'm not saying by any stretch that the Union Army was full of fat men and they were eating high on the hog all the time, but accounts of after battles of all Antietam and Gettysburg and Sharpsburg and places like that, they talk about the dead of the battlefield and how the Confederates, when they laid there and hadn't laid there for a couple of days, they looked, you know, of course, white as a ghost, but more or less the same. And the Union bodies that had been left to lay tended to bloat up and turn black, probably because they had more nutrients inside of them than the Confederates tended to. You know, there were the average weight for a Civil War soldier, and don't quote me on this, this is from my memory, is about 140 to 150 pounds, right? Maybe you're pushing, you know, 160 to 170, but these are slight men all, because they're getting lots of exercise every single day. They're not eating very well. And the body does get used to that, but it does have a long-term cost. And most of these soldiers, even if they lived through the war, tended to have health problems, especially gastrointestinal issues, well after the war was over. So I'm going to see if I can get these flipped. Not.
Civil War spatula.
Yeah, exactly, a Civil War spatula. This is always what my mom said. I always get too impatient and try to flip things too soon. As you can see, what we're ending up with is, in effect, you know, a cornbread patty. And sometimes, of course, this is probably why this was called Kush. It ends up being just a cushy-ushy mess that you would get this. And again, you would throw some salt pork in there. More salt pork as the meat or salt beef. They would be issued, if it was at hand, small parts of salt, small parts of sugar. Again, beans were probably the most common vegetable that would be issued in the North, because those tend to transport a little easier. Dried beans, of course, which means they have to soak them overnight to properly prepare them. The New England regiments apparently were very famous for creating the Boston, or at least the 1860s version of Boston baked beans, right? They would dig holes in the ground and they would get boilers like this and put coals around them and cover them up and cook them, slow cook them for long periods of time. So here we've got some Kush, prepared not as well as it should have been by yours truly. There are some accounts of guys who got good enough for this. They could make the dough and use the ramrods from their musket and sort of coil the dough around the ramrod and set the ramrod over the fire and sort of bake this coiled cornbread thing. But this is what we have today, so it's It's like a slightly flavorful cornbread. Again, it's just water, cornmeal, a little salt, and salt pork grease. So there's not going to be a lot of flavor, but it is a more delectable way to consume their rations than simply eating spoonfuls of cornmeal. And I'm going to put it with some salt pork. It does tend to have some stick-to-itiveness for your guts, but if I had to pick between this and the skilly-gilly, I think I'm going to pick the skilly-gilly any day. So now that we have our meals prepared, of course we want to have something to drink. We've got water in our canteen, but it sure is time for some coffee. So I'm going to use my incredibly handy tool that somehow fits on the end of a musket again. I'm going to take this off the fire. I'm going to bring it over to the table. So again, just to emphasize the fact that this boiler is really just a cup with a lid and a bell handle on it. Handle's kind of cool now. This handle is not. Going to open the lid, use my handy dandy thing, and what we've got here is some, well, it looks to be pretty strong coffee, so I'm going to pour that in. Now some of the grounds are going to come with it. That's the danger of being a Civil War soldier, is having to drink your coffee with coffee grounds right in it. I could use another piece of cloth as a strainer. They did very often do that. But there I've got this cup, and notice this is a pretty good sized cup because the soldiers knew they were going to perhaps have a lot of coffee. They might have to use this as a cooking implement. So this is the Army cups are pretty good sized cups. They're not small and dainty like you may think they are, and it smells pretty good. Probably not what you're used to at the coffee house of your choice, but it's something. So today we've made some skilly-gilly, we've made some Kush, we've made some salt pork, we've made some weak yet strong coffee, and I think it's really interesting to look at history from this perspective, especially Civil War history. We so often think about what the causes of the war were. You know, was it slavery? Was it states' rights? We look at the battles and the leaders, but there's something very humanizing about getting down to the very nitty-gritty about soldiers on all sides and seeing how they live their day-to-day. I think that can create as much of a connection with the past as anything else we can study, and just knowing something as simple as what they ate that we today take for granted can really give an insight into the sacrifices and the struggles and just the everyday life of the people who came before us. Thanks for joining us for this great members only live stream. We hope you enjoyed it. I want to thank you for all the support you give us. Programs like this and everything else we do is possible because of you. So thanks for tuning in, and until we see you next time, stay safe, take care, and eat something good.